Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. You know how it is, you want to get right to the heart of these complicated issues quickly but thoroughly. Well, today we're going to unpack Africa's untapped trade potential and how to make it grow sustainably.
Sounds interesting.
It is, especially because it's based on a recent report that we're going to look at.
Oh, great. Which one?
It's a report by the MCB Group.
Got it.
And right from the start, it hits you with this fascinating paradox. Africa has all these resources and huge needs within the continent, but intra-African trade only makes up something like 16% of Africa's total trade. So the question is, how come?
Yeah, good question. I'm curious to explore that.
And that's what we're going to explore in this deep dive. We're going to extract the most crucial insights about what Africa's trade landscape looks like right now, what kind of opportunities there are, and how we can get to sustainable expansion.
I'm ready to jump in.
Me too. So to start us off, can you give us a broad overview of the economic and trade developments in Africa, let's say over the past couple of decades?
Sure. The last 2 decades have seen some impressive economic growth in Africa. Like the average annual GDP growth has been around 4.6%. You probably remember how the narrative shifted from hopeless continent to Africa rising, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do remember that.
So that period saw a big increase in foreign direct investment, and we saw a lot of tech innovation hubs popping up. And, better access to things like education, healthcare, modern amenities, all of that helped lift millions out of poverty.
Yeah, it's been a pretty remarkable transformation, but, as the report highlights, it hasn't been uniform across the whole continent.
Right, you're absolutely correct. Some regions are still struggling with high poverty and low human development.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex situation.
Yeah, it is.
So within all this, how has trade specifically contributed to the continent's economic expansion?
Well, trade has actually been a really key driver of that expansion. Take sub-Saharan Africa, for example. From 2013 to 2023, the exports of goods and services went up by 26%.
Wow, that's a significant jump.
It is. And this increasing trade openness, well, it spurred economic growth because it led to more export revenues, attracted hard currency inflows, and provided a really key foundation for industrialization.
So trade really set off this positive chain reaction.
Yeah, exactly. And while commodities are still the dominant thing in exports, the fact that there's this gradual diversification, that encouraged technological advancements and boosted productivity across various sectors. And of course, trade has also been vital in creating jobs and generating income, which are really crucial for improving people's lives.
Yeah, for sure.
And on top of that, you have the investments in infrastructure, which were stimulated by this increased trade demand. That led to better connectivity and efficiency, further boosting economic activity. So overall, trade has really strengthened economic resilience, promoted competitive markets, and it's been a major contributor to the ongoing transformation and sustainable growth of the continent.
But of course, then the COVID-19 pandemic hit and kind of put a brake on things, right?
Yeah, exactly. In 2020, sub-Saharan Africa actually experienced a real GDP contraction of 1.6%, which was its first recession in 25 years. It was a tough time, especially for those economies heavily reliant on tourism or exporting oil.
Yeah, definitely a challenging period.
It was. And although recovery started the following year, economic growth slowed down again in 2022 and reached 3.6% in 2023. There were various factors, like the impact of the war in Ukraine, rising trade tensions between the U.S. and China, and the lingering effects of the pandemic. And the region was also facing worsening climate shocks, weak global demand, internal supply issues, and a growing debt burden.
Yeah, quite a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
So in this context, where do initiatives like the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, stand?
Right. So initiatives like the AfCFTA have been really important for boosting regional integration and encouraging trade within Africa. They have the potential to create bigger, more integrated markets, promoting economic cooperation and development.
It sounds promising.
It really does. And the report highlights several key ways trade contributes to socioeconomic progress.
Can you break those down for us?
Sure. First, we've got economic growth. Trade is a major driver of growth in African countries. Increased exports, especially of commodities like, oil, minerals, and agricultural products, have provided vital revenue. The World Bank estimated that between 2000 and 2019, countries that increased their trade openness by 1% actually experienced an average increase in GDP growth of about 0.2 percentage points.
Interesting. That's a pretty direct link.
Yeah. And then there's job creation. Trade has facilitated job creation, particularly in export-oriented industries like agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. That contributes to poverty reduction and overall better living standards.
Right, makes sense. What about the impact on infrastructure?
Yeah, although there's still a significant infrastructure gap, trade has definitely stimulated investment in this area, including ports, roads, and railways. This has improved connectivity and reduced transportation costs, which makes trade easier both within Africa and internationally.
Yeah, definitely essential.
Absolutely. And then we have better market access. Trade opens up global markets, allowing African countries to diversify their economies. This reduces their reliance on just a few commodities, making them less vulnerable to price fluctuations.
And of course, as we mentioned, regional integration through the AfCFTA.
Exactly. And finally, there's the energy transition. Trade can actually support Africa's energy transition by leveraging its vast natural resources.
Like what, specifically?
Well, they've got a lot of minerals that are essential for renewable energy technologies, so they could become a key supplier for the global energy transition. By promoting sustainable mining practices and developing value-added industries, Africa can attract investment, create jobs, and increase its global economic influence.
So, lots of potential there.
Definitely. The report even gives some examples of the largest exports by country, like crude oil for Nigeria, tea for Kenya, phosphates for Morocco, and so on.
That's interesting. But the report also points out some lingering financial challenges. Can you tell us a bit more about these Eurobond redemptions you mentioned? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so despite all this progress, the region is still dealing with funding shortages, high borrowing costs, and refinancing risks because of consistently low domestic resource mobilization. And there are substantial external debt repayments coming up in the next few years, with Eurobond redemptions of about USD 5.5 billion across 8 countries, including Nigeria, Angola, and Kenya.
So what are Eurobonds exactly?
Basically, Eurobonds are debt issued by governments in a foreign currency. So that means they're mainly in US dollars or euros. And since these repayments are looming, it's putting pressure on these countries' foreign exchange reserves.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And on top of that, the continent is facing this huge trade finance gap, which is estimated to be somewhere between USD 80 and 120 billion annually.
So what does that mean? A trade finance gap?
Well, it's basically the difference between the funding needed to support trade activities and the funding that's actually available. It's limiting their ability to finance infrastructure and development projects, impacting the quality of life for many.
Right, so that's a serious obstacle.
Yeah, it is. And then you have the currency crisis.
Which is?
Oh, sorry. Exchange rate pressures and foreign exchange shortages are major concerns for policymakers. Last year, most currencies in the region actually depreciated against the US dollar, intensifying these financing constraints.
So it's becoming even harder to secure funding.
Yeah, pretty much. And to make things even more complicated, about 80% of countries had reserves below 5 months of imports at the end of 2023.
So it's a pretty precarious situation.
It is. And then you add in the elevated geopolitical risks.
Tell us about that.
Well, the escalation of the conflict in the Middle East could cause more disruptions to supply chains, transportation routes, and the production of commodities.
And this could lead to?
This could lead to higher commodity prices and shipping costs. And the risk of social and political tensions has also increased significantly because of, growing geopolitical fragmentation, coup d'etat, there have been 11 since 2020, and a cost of living crisis that's left many people behind.
Yeah, it's a very unstable environment.
It is, and that's been exacerbated by the effects of climate change. Actually, 40% of sub-Saharan Africa is classified as fragile or conflict affected, and the region also saw 18 national elections in 2024.
Oh, lots of political uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly. And landlocked African countries continue to face significant transportation challenges.
Like what?
Well, limited infrastructure and high logistics costs that hinder their access to global markets. And then you have port congestion at major African ports. That adds to the delays and increases shipping costs. It makes it even harder for the region to move goods efficiently across borders.
That's a whole lot of obstacles to overcome.
It is, but even with all that, the economic outlook is still cautiously optimistic.
So there's still hope for positive development.
Yeah, definitely. Sub-Saharan Africa's growth is actually expected to pick up slightly, reaching 4.2% in 2025, up from 3.6% in 2024.
That's good news.
It is. This basically signals a gradual but steady recovery path.
What's driving this recovery?
It's expected to be driven by an improvement in economic activity and an easing of supply constraints. And the services sector, particularly tourism, is expected to contribute significantly to this growth as global travel continues to normalize.
Yeah, so trade remains a central pillar of Africa's economic trajectory.
Absolutely.
The report also talks about shifting global trade patterns. What are some key trends to look out for?
Well, according to the World Economic Forum, protectionist measures are still the most significant risk that could shape the trade outlook. Other important factors to watch include things like supply chain restructuring, the impact of conflicts and sanctions, and national security concerns.
And where does Africa fit into this changing global trade landscape?
Well, Africa's trade profile kind of highlights both its wealth of resources and its economic development challenges. Historically, trade in goods has dominated because of the continent's rich natural resources. In fact, 83% of African countries are classified as commodity dependent.
So what's the outlook for trade in goods moving forward?
It's important to highlight that trade in intermediate goods is playing an increasingly vital role in Africa's economic development. In recent years, the growth rate of intermediate goods exports has significantly outpaced that of imports, and that has led to a substantial reduction in Africa's trade deficit in intermediate goods. In 2022, African exports of intermediate goods, excluding fuels, were estimated at USD 312 billion, up from USD 196 billion in 2019.
So a significant increase.
Yeah, it is. And this actually represented more than 3/4 of Africa's total non-fuel merchandise exports, and that's actually the highest share globally.
Wow, I wouldn't have guessed that. So what kind of products are we talking about with this intermediate goods trade?
Okay, so African intermediate goods exports mainly consist of raw or semi-processed materials and primary products that are integrated into global value chains at less advanced production stages. These exports encompass a diverse range of products, including ores, minerals, and gemstones.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure, like iron, rhodium, non-monetary gold, and diamonds. And then there's agricultural inputs like cocoa, coffee, and cotton, as well as manufactured parts, components, and accessories used by industries to produce final goods, like car wiring kits, for example.
Interesting.
Yeah, overall, African intermediate goods trade is characterized by a heavy concentration on a few key commodities and countries. But the increase in this trade suggests a growing integration into global value chains.
Yeah, which is essential for moving beyond just exporting raw materials.
Exactly.
What about the services sector? How's that been doing?
Well, the services trade sector in Africa has grown in value over the years, but its share of total trade has remained broadly stable at around 20%. Traditional services like travel and transport still dominate, accounting for about 2/3 of services and relying heavily on low-skilled labor. However, it's worth noting that knowledge-intensive services, particularly in finance and ICT, have seen significant growth.
Interesting.
Yeah, the expansion of these knowledge-intensive services, despite their smaller overall share, signals a potential path for Africa toward higher value activities.
Makes sense. Now, the report also highlights the importance of AGO for trade between the U.S. and Africa. Can you remind us what that stands for?
Yeah, sure. AGO stands for the African Growth and Opportunity Act.
Right.
It's a U.S. trade law that has been instrumental in promoting trade between the U.S. and a lot of African countries. U.S. imports from Africa actually jumped from USD 27.6 billion in 2000 to USD 113.5 billion in 2008, just before the global financial crisis.
Wow, that's impressive.
It is. And, exports through AGOA have supported job creation in countries that have been able to leverage the export opportunities. For example, the garment industry created substantial employment opportunities in Lesotho, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And elsewhere, South Africa was able to diversify its export portfolio, exporting things like vehicles, machinery, and agricultural products to the U.S. And Kenya, in addition to its textile sector, also benefited from flour exports to the U.S.
So a real success story in many ways.
Never.
But that growth hasn't been even across the board. And African exports to the U.S. have remained concentrated, suggesting that preferential access alone isn't enough.
Right. African exports to the U.S. have remained focused on a limited range of commodities, particularly oil, minerals, and agricultural products. And from 2000 to the end of 2023, energy resources, especially crude oil and its derivatives, have dominated sub-Saharan African exports to the U.S. under the AGOA program.
How much you're talking?
It totaled USD 483.3 billion, representing 83.6% of AGOA exports.
Wow.
Vehicles, apparel, iron, and steel follow, contributing significantly less with 4.4%, 4.3%, and 2.0% respectively. So, after the 2007-08 global financial crisis, African exports to the U.S. saw a significant decline.
Why was that?
It reflected the strategic shift in U.S. policy towards energy independence. So the takeaway here is that despite preferential access, the lack of diversification and infrastructure limitations have prevented many African countries from fully benefiting from AGO, highlighting a crucial need for strengthening internal capacity.
And this has highlighted Africa's vulnerability to a lack of export diversification.
Exactly. So despite having duty-free access to the U.S. market for eligible products through AGO, there are several obstacles that still prevent African economies from fully capitalizing on these opportunities.
Such as?
Well, for starters, the benefits of AGA haven't been evenly distributed. The gains have been concentrated in just a few countries and sectors. Many eligible countries struggle to leverage AGO due to things like inadequate infrastructure, policies, and capacity.
And what about the infrastructure problems?
Well, poor infrastructure that includes transportation networks, port facilities, and logistical systems that hinders the efficient movement of goods. And high transport costs, customs delays, and unreliable supply chains add to the cost and reduce the competitiveness of African products in the U.S. market.
Right. Those logistical inefficiencies deter both African exporters and U.S. importers from increasing trade volumes.
Exactly. And, AGO doesn't address all aspects of market access.
Seating.
Well, while AGO facilitates duty-free access, it doesn't comprehensively address other critical aspects of market access, like things like non-tariff barriers, intellectual property rights, and investment protection. And the absence of these comprehensive market access measures makes it difficult for African exporters to expand their footprint in the U.S. market beyond specific product categories. So basically, the full potential of AGA remains untapped, which underscores the need for broader structural and policy reforms to improve trade capacity and competitiveness.
Oh. And then there's the uncertain future of AGOA itself, as well as the growing influence of China and Africa through FOCAC. Can you remind us what that stands for?
Sure. FOCAC stands for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation.
Right.
So the future of AGOA remains uncertain, particularly with changing government administrations in the U.S. While AGOA has historically enjoyed bipartisan support in Congress, recent shifts towards protectionist policies raise concerns about its continuation.
So it might not even exist in a few years.
There's a chance of that. And there's also a chance that the terms of AGOA could be significantly altered. Like, we might see stricter rules of origin and a reduction in the range of products eligible for duty-free access. And the growing influence of China and Africa through FOCAC could also play a role.
How so?
Well, through initiatives like FOCAC, China has become a key economic partner for many African countries. China's focus on infrastructure development and targeted investments kind of contrasts with the conditions attached to AGO. This potentially makes Chinese partnerships more attractive to African countries. So the evolving dynamic between the future of AGOA and China's strategic investments will play a crucial role in shaping the economic landscape and diplomatic relationships in sub-Saharan Africa.
It's a really complex situation with many moving parts.
It is.
Let's shift our focus now to developments in intra-African trade.
Okay, sure.
The report highlights some progress, albeit slow.
Yes. Over the past few decades, there has been some gradual progress in trade across the continent. According to the IMF, since the 1980s, the share of regional exports in total exports has more than tripled.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, it is. And the real potential for Africa lies in trading with itself. It not only boosts growth, but also fosters unity across the continent. As the IMF has shown, on average, a 5 percentage point increase in the export-weighted growth rate of intra-regional partners is actually associated with about a 0.5% increase in the growth of a typical sub-Saharan African country.
So there's a clear economic benefit to trading within the continent.
Definitely.
But despite this, intra-African trade still lags behind other regions of the world. Why is there this persistent slowness?
Well, overall, intra-African trade continues to lag behind key regions, representing just 16% of Africa's total trade in 2023.
Wow, so compared to the EU and Asia.
Compared to the EU, it's about 70% for intra-EU trade, and for Asia, it's around 60% for intra-Asian trade.
So it's significantly lower.
Yeah, it is. And this slow growth in intra-African trade kind of highlights the continent's continued reliance on external markets. And that makes them vulnerable to global economic shocks and disruptions.
Right, so by improving intra-African trade, it's widely believed that Africa could reduce its dependence on external markets, fostering economic independence and stability across the continent.
Exactly.
But there are still a lot of barriers holding intra-African trade back, even with multiple regional trade agreements and the AfCFTA.
Yeah, there are. Factors like infrastructure deficits, trade barriers, limited product complementarity, and historical trade patterns all play a role. And the remaining 84% of African trade, which represents USD 1.07 trillion, is extra-African trade, mainly with partners like China, the European Union, and the US.
So the majority of their trade is still happening outside of the continent.
Yeah, unfortunately it is.
The report also points to a concentration of this intra-African trade. A few countries seem to dominate regional exchanges.
Right, there are significant reservations about the optimism regarding sub-Saharan African integration. As it stands, the bulk of interregional trade is heavily concentrated. 10 sub-Saharan African countries account for 65% of the total regional demand for interregional exports. And as the destination market for the bulk of interregional trade, they have the potential to generate the largest regional spillovers.
Interesting.
Yeah. And Southern Africa emerges as the primary driver, remarkably contributing 41.1% of trade with neighboring countries. West Africa has consolidated its position as the second trading subregion, followed by East Africa. At the country level, South Africa has long been the leading driver of intra-African trade.
How much trade are we talking?
It accounts for about 20% of total intra-African trade in 2023. So this concentration of trade activity in a few key countries, such as South Africa, Côte d'Ivoire, Egypt, and Nigeria, highlights the uneven distribution of trade benefits within the continent.
What about the role of the various regional trading blocs like SADC, EAC, or SACU? Can you remind us what these acronyms stand for?
Of course. So SADC is the Southern African Development Community, EAC is the East African Community, and SACU is the Southern African Customs Union.
Right, so how do they fit into the picture?
Well, for SADC, EAC, and SACU, trade within those regions actually accounts for over 70% of their member countries' interregional trade. And in the CEMAC region, the Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa and the UMOA region, the West African Economic and Monetary Union trade within those regions accounts for about 50% of their interregional trade.
Wow, so there are significant differences in integration levels across the continent.
Yeah, and in absolute terms, SADC and SAC account for over 70% and 50% of sub-Saharan Africa's total trade, respectively. So these figures indicate that regional integration is more advanced and effective in some parts of the continent than in others.
It makes sense that those with higher levels of integration would have more intra-regional trade.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the forecasts for intra-African trade growth in the near term seem modest. What could change this trajectory?
Well, a slight increase in intra-African trade is projected, just a meager 0.8% on average in the coming years. So positive trade growth really hinges on the implementation of appropriate policies and initiatives across the continent.
What needs to be done specifically?
The effective implementation of the AfCFTA is vital, and so are innovative programs and facilities to support this growth. And gradually phasing out trade barriers, both tariff and non-tariff, and efforts to develop cross-border transport corridors, those will further boost intra-African trade.
Makes sense. But the report does highlight a gradual transformation of this intra-African trade with increasing diversification. That's an encouraging sign, right?
Absolutely. Intra-African trade is gradually undergoing a transformation, marked by increasing diversification, and that enhances economic resilience across the continent. Intra-African trade really holds the key to the continent's economic renaissance. Well, in the face of shifting geopolitical landscapes, African nations are strategically reorienting their commodity supply chains. They're reducing their dependence on traditional markets by trading more with their African neighbors or tapping into new potentials such as trade with the EU. This shift not only strengthens their economic autonomy, but also positions Africa as a central player in the global energy transition, leveraging its abundant renewable resources to sustainably meet growing global energy demand.
So it's a win-win situation.
Definitely. And this changing dynamic is also reflected in the nature of the goods being traded.
How so?
Well, the implementation of the AfCFTA could have a massive impact on this diversification and the overall volume of intra-African trade.
Do we have any estimates on what that impact could look like?
There are estimates suggesting that the implementation of the AfCFTA could lead to an increase of up to 109% in the value of intra-African trade.
Wow, that's huge.
It is. And there's also the potential for real income gains of up to 9%, a boost to production and productivity, and the possibility of lifting as many as 50 million people out of extreme poverty.
So it's a game changer.
It could be. And the thing is, Africa's trade with other regions and countries focuses mainly on commodities like fuels and metals, which don't really foster industrialization.
And intra-African trade is different.
Yeah, it's much more diversified. 45% of trade is made up of manufactured goods, compared to only 20% of exports outside the continent.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is, and it highlights the greater potential for value addition and industrialization within intra-African trade.
The development of regional value chains seems to be a key element of this diversification.
Yeah, exactly. There's growing attention to developing regional value chains where different countries contribute to different stages of production. And this is particularly evident in sectors like textiles, automotive, and agri-food.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's potential across Africa to transform cocoa beans into chocolate, cotton into textiles and garments, and coffee beans into brewed coffee. For example, East Africa is developing a regional value chain in the textile and apparel industry, with countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Rwanda playing key roles at different stages of the production process.
So you have different countries specializing in different parts of the process.
Exactly. And then you have those finished goods being traded within the continent.
Right. And improved infrastructure, particularly cross-border infrastructure, is essential to support the development of these value chains and trade in general.
Absolutely. Investments in infrastructure, such as roads, railways, and ports, improve connectivity between African countries. And that reduces the cost and time of transporting goods across borders, facilitating trade in a more diverse range of products. Projects like the Standard Gauge Railway in East Africa and the expansion of the Port of Mombasa are key examples.
So these are real, tangible projects that are already making a difference.
Yeah. And following the construction of the Ethiopia-Djibouti corridor, a vital trade route, trade volumes between the two countries actually increased by 30% in the first year of AfCFTA implementation.
That's a significant increase.
It is. It demonstrates the trade potential unlocked by improved logistics and streamlined customs procedures.
So the benefits of improved infrastructure are clear.
Definitely. And the report also gives some real-world examples of how the AfCFTA is already making a difference on the ground.
Oh, that's great. Can you share some of those examples?
Sure. Its implementation has facilitated a significant increase in Rwandan exports to Kenya, particularly in the agriculture and manufacturing sectors.
How much of an increase?
Rwandan exports to Kenya actually increased by 42% between 2020 and 2022. And despite historical trade tensions, Ghana and Nigeria have also increased their bilateral trade.
In what areas?
Especially in manufactured goods.
Interesting.
Yeah. Trade between the two countries actually grew by 20% in 2022, illustrating the impact of harmonizing trade policies. And then there's the rise of e-commerce and digital trade platforms. That's facilitating trade in a wider range of goods and services as well. Platforms like Jumia and Kilimall enable businesses to reach customers across the continent. And that supports the diversification of products available for intra-African trade. So the diversification of intra-African trade is really happening.
That's great to hear. Now, let's delve into Africa's sustainable trade potential. It's an increasingly important concept that balances economic growth with environmental responsibility and social benefits.
Absolutely. Africa holds tremendous potential for sustainable trade thanks to its vast natural resources, its emerging markets, and its commitment to environmental responsibility.
So it's not just about economic growth, but also about ensuring that growth is sustainable and benefits everyone.
Exactly. And African banks are taking an increasingly active role in promoting sustainable trade solutions.
How are they doing that?
They're providing innovative financing solutions and partnerships to generate positive environmental and social impacts across the region. This section explores the opportunities and challenges facing the continent in developing sustainable trade practices, underpinned by some key success stories.
Let's start with sustainable agriculture. It's absolutely crucial for Africa, employing a large portion of the population and directly impacting food security.
Yeah, sustainable agriculture has huge potential to enhance intra-African trade, contributing to economic growth and food security. Sustainable practices in agriculture on the continent could boost productivity by up to 30%, according to the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations.
Wow, that's a significant increase.
It is. And Africa's agricultural production potential is vast. 65% of the world's unused arable land is located on the continent.
Wow, so there's a lot of room for growth.
Yeah. And promoting agricultural value chains and improving market access can help diversify economies, boost incomes, increase food security and economic stability, mitigate conflicts, and prevent internal and external migration. So the benefits are both for Africa and for the world. According to the World Economic Forum, initiatives that shift farmers from conventional to regenerative agricultural practices have a more lasting impact, boosting productivity and transforming the sector into one with high added value.
The market potential for food and agriculture in Africa is huge, but unfortunately, food security remains a major challenge on the continent.
According to the AfDB, the African Development Bank, the African food and agriculture market alone has the potential to increase from USD 280 billion per year in 2023 to USD 1 trillion by 2030.
So the potential is there, but there's still obstacles to overcome.
Yeah. The agricultural sector in Africa already contributes 35% of GDP and employs over half of the labor force.
It's clearly a major part of the economy.
Yeah. But despite this, Africa is the most food insecure region in the world, with over 232 million people undernourished.
That's a stark contrast.
It is. And the report cites success stories in sustainable agriculture, like Apollo agriculture in Kenya and Zambia.
What do?
They use technology to support smallholder farmers with quality seeds, fertilizers, insurance, and financing, while promoting climate-smart agriculture. And the Virtual Irrigation Academy is also mentioned for its low-cost and efficient water and fertilizer management tools. These examples show how innovation can help reconcile agricultural potential with the imperative of food security.
It's encouraging to see those success stories.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, Africa also has an absolutely key role to play in the global energy transition, given its natural resources.
Absolutely. The global shift to clean energy is driving a significant surge in demand for energy transition minerals, and this trend is expected to accelerate in the coming years and decades.
What's driving this demand?
From electric vehicles to solar panels to upcoming innovations, the global clean energy transition is projected to significantly increase the demand for key minerals.
Like what?
By 2050, nickel demand is expected to double, cobalt to triple, and lithium to increase tenfold, according to the IEA, the International Energy Agency.
Wow, those are some big increases.
Yeah, they are. And sub-Saharan Africa is at the heart of this dynamic, as it is estimated to hold about 30% of the proven reserves for these critical minerals. And this transition, if managed effectively, could be transformative for the region.
And the continent could become a major player not just in extracting these minerals, but also in green manufacturing and global supply chains.
Exactly. The continent could play a central role in green manufacturing and global supply chains, significantly reducing carbon emissions. Africa's abundance and low seasonality of renewable energy sources also enable it to provide much cheaper and more reliable baseload power for industrial production than in other regions.
Can you give me an example of the cost difference?
Well, Kenya's renewable baseload power costs half as much as that in Spain, which is among the best sites for renewable power generation in Europe.
Wow, so a significant difference.
Yeah, it is. And by aggressively deploying these resources, Africa can deliver energy access to all its citizens, including the estimated 600 million currently without access and the 150 million with unreliable access.
Right.